On a chilly January afternoon in 1919, the busy streets of Boston's North End bustled with life. Horses clattered along the cobblestones, children played near the wharves, and workers paused for their midday meal. Nothing seemed unusual, until suddenly, the ground began to tremble, and an unimaginable force swept across the city. The disaster that followed would go down in history as both tragic and strangely unbelievable. It became known as the Great Molasses Flood. Towering over the neighborhood stood an enormous storage tank. 50 feet high and 90 feet across, the steel giant belonged to the Purity Distilling Company. Inside it sloshed more than 2 million gallons of molasses, waiting to be transformed into rum. For years, the people who lived nearby had heard the tank groan in the sun. They saw dark syrup seep through its seams, and children often ran with cups or sticks to scoop up the leaks. Locals joked about it, but they also whispered about its danger. To the company, those warnings meant little. When leaks grew too visible, managers simply painted the tank brown to disguise the dripping stains. January 15th dawned warmer than usual. The temperature had risen sharply after a string of freezing days. Inside the tank, the sticky liquid expanded in the sudden heat. At around 12:30 in the afternoon, the steel finally gave way. Witnesses described hearing something like machine gun fire as rivets popped free. Then came a thunderous roar, followed by an explosion that shook the ground like an earthquake. In the next instant, the tank split apart, and a wave of molasses surged into the streets. It was not a trickle, not a spill, but a dark wall 25 feet high, rushing at nearly 35 miles per hour. Houses were crushed as though they were made of paper. Wooden wagons splintered like toys. Horses were swallowed whole, their frantic cries muffled as they disappeared beneath the sticky tide. For the people caught in the flood, it was almost impossible to escape. Molasses is far denser than water, and once it wrapped around legs and arms, it pulled victims down like quicksand. Some managed to scramble onto floating debris, clinging desperately until rescuers arrived. Others were trapped in the thick, suffocating mass, struggling for breath as the syrup hardened in the winter air. Survivors remembered the chaos in haunting detail. One said, "Molasses waist deep, people screaming, trapped." Another recalled, "We heard a roar, then the world turned brown." The cries of people and animals mixed with the smell of sugar, and the scene turned nightmarish. When at last the torrent slowed, the devastation was almost beyond belief. 21 people had lost their lives, and 150 more were injured. The youngest victim was only 10 years old, and the oldest, 78. Entire families were torn apart. The neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Buildings collapsed, rail lines twisted like wire, and debris buried under a thick, brown crust. The cleanup became its own ordeal. Workers shoveled for weeks, scraping hardened molasses from brick walls and washing streets with salt water. Firefighters found their boots stuck so tightly in the syrup that some had to cut themselves free. And long after the last shovelful had been removed, Boston carried the memory in its air. On hot summer days, residents swore they could still smell the sweetness. The disaster also led to a reckoning. Families of victims took the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the parent of Purity Distilling, to court. The trial dragged on for years, uncovering damning truths. The tank had been built in haste, with steel too thin to withstand the pressure. No proper engineer had ever tested its strength. The company had known about leaks and ignored them. Eventually, they were forced to pay out millions in damages. From that case came new laws. Engineers were now required to sign off on large structures. Building codes became stricter, safety inspections mandatory. Out of the syrup-soaked ruins of Boston, a new standard of responsibility was born. The Great Molasses Flood may sound absurd to modern ears, as though it belonged to folklore or comedy. But for the people of Boston, it was a day of terror. A sweet, familiar ingredient turned into an instrument of death. It was a reminder that negligence and greed can make even the most harmless things deadly. More than a century later, the memory still lingers. The city remembers the 21 lives lost, the countless injured, the neighborhood forever scarred. And some say that if you walk the streets of the North End on a warm afternoon, when the sun beats hard on the brick and the air grows heavy, you can still catch a faint, ghostly scent of molasses. A sticky whisper from the day Boston drowned in syrup. History hides stories stranger than fiction. Want more forgotten tales like this one? Share this video and keep history alive. Hit subscribe and uncover the past with me.